You are listening to Build Europe, the podcast of the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung European Union. In case you're joining us for the first time, we are the German Green Political Foundation affiliated with the German political party Allianz 90, the Greens. Our EU office represents the foundation vis-à-vis European and international institutions, associations, non-governmental organizations, and media based in Brussels. Today on the Build Europe podcast, we discuss the role of healthy soils for climate mitigation and adaptation, biodiversity, and food production.
Dieser Kompost liegt hier jetzt seit...
Now after 3 years, all the leaves, all the branches have rotted. Everything is composted. Now the soil is so fine that I can spread it on the beds in the autumn. I am happy to cultivate my land here.
Und auch an Blumen, damit es neue Komposterde kriegt, dann wächst das besser.
A gardener tends to her compost in autumn so she can provide nutrient-rich soil for her lettuce and tomato patch in the future. As she lets the fresh soil trickle through her fingers, she feels a close connection to her land. She's happy she can cultivate her own piece of land and produce her own food on these 2 hectares: potatoes, pumpkins, apples, and quinces.
With this podcast, we want to take a journey through the universe of soil. Visit the cosmos where plants take root in moist soil, where animals and microorganisms live, where rare minerals and trace elements can be found. A habitat so complex that we have only just begun to understand it. We trust the soils and rely on our fields to provide us with stable harvests year after year, to help filter our groundwater, but also to store carbon to help absorb the impacts of climate change.
The ground also provides the foundations for our houses, roads, and factories. It creates the spaces where our children can play, and provides the landscapes where we not only hike and spend our free time, but where food also grows. Yet land and soil are the subject of bitter disputes. Agricultural land is becoming increasingly scarce in Europe, and prices for land are rising. Many people are asking,
why are more and more farmers throughout Europe losing their livelihoods, their fields? Many farmers want to keep farming, but with skyrocketing land prices leading to a scarcity of available and affordable land, it's getting harder and harder for them to do so. More and more agricultural land is being sealed for roads and cities, or is needed to build solar panels. Large agricultural corporations are squeezing out small businesses across Europe, but especially in Eastern Europe. For some, speculation with land and soil is a billion-dollar business. For others, their livelihoods depend on the land issue.
so why is there such a struggle for the increasingly scarce land, with consequences for all of us?
Soil Atlas 2024, a Build Europe podcast by Peter Kreisler. Part 2, Land for Sale.
Oh, great to see you on the coffee. Tell me your name, who you are, and where we at.
My name is Jobst Junge-Hölsing, and I'm an agricultural engineer and worked for, I think, 35 years in the agricultural administration in Germany, and in the last years also in the Ministry for Nutrition and Agriculture.
Mr. Junge-Hölsing, former head of division at the German Ministry of Food and Agriculture and a recognized expert on land prices, has been observing the development of speculation for decades. Until his retirement last year, he repeatedly tried to draw attention to the issue of skyrocketing land prices in Germany, but in vain, as he has to admit today. The loss of agricultural land in Germany is accelerating. How much of this land do we lose on average, I want to know?
We have lost 1.4 million hectares of agricultural land in Germany since the 90s. For infrastructure, but also for nature conservation measures. And that's almost the entire agricultural area of Belgium.
We've lost 1.4 million hectares of agricultural land in Germany since 1992, and the remaining land is becoming more and more expensive. there is a long-term trend and is creating problems that policymakers in EU countries have rarely been able to get a grip on. According to Junge Husing, Germany is currently losing 107 hectares of agricultural land every day. This issue has been intensifying for 20 years. Junge Husing sees an urgent need for action. You have to understand that agricultural land is finite, he says with a smirk.
The writer Mark Twain said 130 years ago, by farmland, the good Lord won't make any more. And today the situation is even worse. We are losing farmland around the world every day, like in Germany, for infrastructure, but also for environmental reasons. And these are excellent conditions for speculation. Investors have stepped in since the financial crisis, and their demand is driving up the prices. Other investors see the result, the price is going high, and go to the market as well. This has resulted in a price spiral for 19 years now in Germany. And this is a kind of herd behavior like on the stock exchanges.
Another factor that's currently driving land prices higher is electricity generation through photovoltaics and wind power. In Germany, energy is increasingly being produced on solar farms, which require a particularly large area, 6 times more than wind.
Agricultural land is often the solution, as it can provide the thousands of hectares of land needed for the construction of large solar farms. With the dramatic drop in prices for photovoltaic electricity production and the easing of approval requirements for the construction of new plants, a real solar energy boom has been unleashed in Germany. In itself, this is a welcome development, a key factor in combating the climate crisis. But the unrestrained growth is misdirected, says Junge Husing, because the solar farms should be built elsewhere.
One current trend is the construction of solar energy systems on farmland. We actually have enough space for the solar energy on roofs, surfaces and infrastructure areas in Germany, but the companies prefer to build the constructions on arable land. And as a result, we could lose another 500,000 hectares just in a few years. That would be the food base for around 2 million people.
So you can make so much more money generating energy from solar power than you can from working the land to produce food?
The average lease for farmland, which a farmer can pay in Germany, it's €350 per hectare. And the companies who build up solar energy systems there pay 3,000 or 4,000 euro lease per hectare. And there no farmer can compete with.
If you can make 10 times more money from energy generation than from agriculture, it's clear what will happen. Prices for purchasing and leasing land will skyrocket. And small family-run farms, which can hardly make ends meet with the prices they get for their harvest, will start to consider selling their land to energy companies. Fields that have been leased for decades are now increasingly being used for energy generation. Junge Husing sees a danger in this unchecked momentum.
This is a real gold rush just now in Germany. With solar energy systems on the farmland, you can make a profit of around 15,000 euro a year per hectare. Okay. And for comparison, the profit in agriculture is around 500 euro per hectare per year. No farmer, no conventional farmer and no organic farmer can compete with the solar energy companies, and that's a great problem. It's a license to print money for the moment there.
Okay.
But the survival of small-scale agriculture is increasingly at stake. More and more businesses are being forced to give up, and the demise of farms is accelerating. Meanwhile, the big energy companies are also entering the land market. Top prices are being paid for farmland, and there's a real gold rush mentality, especially in the eastern regions of the country, as Junge Husing explains.
But also in other parts of Europe, the battle for land and soil is becoming increasingly fierce. In the process, major investors are becoming more and more adept at avoiding taxes. In the opaque land market, this is easier than one might initially believe. The land deals are being cleverly and secretly arranged. It's what in the industry jargon is called a share deal.
The main problems are very similar in all the European countries. The loss of agricultural land and the idea of investors of buying farmland. But one problem is that we have share deals by legal entities, and they circumvene the laws, the old laws for agricultural farmland market. And today these legal entities are a normal part of agricultural structure. However, they were not properly regulated in the land law. Investors use this loophole to buy land on a large scale, and this is called a share deal. They buy the land and thus undermine the German preemptive right of farmers, and this as well circumvenes the control of speculation. So that's the situation in Germany.
A look at other European countries shows that there are ways to counteract this dangerous trend. In France, an attempt has been made to get a better grip on the land market with a comprehensive land law reform.
French colleagues in France, this legal loophole was closed in 2023, so 1 year ago.
And what happened then?
And their share deals with farmland must first be reported to the authorities. And if the new farm is larger than 150 hectares, the authorities check the share deal. And they can approve the takeover, or they can grant it with conditions, or they can prohibit it.
What was the goal of this new French land legislation?
There are two aims of the new regulation: prevent land concentration and support young farmers. And another important as well is to get rid of the financial investors on the farmland market.
But was the law a success? Perhaps conclusions could be drawn from it to reform the land and property law in other countries as well, in order to better protect small family businesses in particular.
The French colleagues said that it works very proper to keep the financial investors out of the market. It would be a good model for Germany because the structure of agriculture between France and Germany is very similar, and the French law is in compliance with the European law.
A success that other EU countries could learn from, says Junge-Hösing. After all, the law is in line with European law. The French experience has been positive, as farmers are hardly losing any agricultural land through share deals.
Large investors are subject to close and critical scrutiny by French colleagues. In France, it wouldn't be possible for deals to take place behind closed doors. For Junge-Hösing, it's important that the farmers are given the first option to buy, thereby allowing the existing small-scale farming structure to be better preserved. But the overall trend in the EU is going in a different direction. Farms are getting bigger and bigger, with more technologically advanced equipment and high inputs such as chemical pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. More and more soil is being farmed with heavy machinery in a highly efficient manner. Cash crops such as corn and grain are grown with high productivity and efficiency, increasingly as large monocultures. In the process, the soil is becoming more and more depleted. In Germany, attempts have been ongoing at state level for years to counteract this development with laws against land speculation.
In many countries, there have been legislative initiatives to create a new agricultural structure law, as is the case in France. So new laws that are coming, that should be promising, isn't it? What happens to these laws?
That's very difficult in Germany. I think now 7 agricultural ministers have failed with this idea. And one important reason for this is the lack of transparency on the land market. Now authority in Germany knows how many hectares are today sold to an investor, and so the public cannot recognize the problem.
So it's a black box.
It's a really black box, And of course, there are people who are interested to keep this black box alive. The investors, agricultural holding companies, have bought many farms, especially in East Germany. And these farms are also members of farmers' associations. And these associations have no interest in transparency and combating speculation. And they consistently oppose any draft regulation. The result for active farmers is that they can no longer compete with rising rents, and young people cannot finance land to set up a farm. That's a problem.
So all the attempted legislation in the past years have been a failure?
Until today, yes, but the problems exist on. We have lots of farmland, we have investors, and the more problems we have, the more the prices will rise.
Jobst Junge-Hösing, who worked as an economist and land expert at the Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture for over 35 years, is skeptical about the future if nothing changes. Lost in thought, he looks out onto the autumn streetscape from a Berlin cafe.
The pressure on politics will grow to make modern agricultural laws for this land market.
When land is so expensive, investors look to other areas to accumulate large tracts of farmland. In Eastern Europe in particular, land is relatively cheap. In many Eastern Bloc countries, after the end of the Cold War, large parts of the agricultural land of the socialist kolkhozes remained under the authority of the state. This presented a historic opportunity for a fair and modern, more sustainable land distribution.
Well, Romania is an agrarian country of Europe. Romania is the country statistically with most farmers in the European Union.
Romania seems to be an interesting example in this context. While 40% of the agricultural land has already been bought up, a large number of small farms still exist because the Romanian state returned much of the land to the original landowners after the collapse of the Ceausescu regime. Attila Schatz of Eco-Rurales explains that this was in line with a law dating back to the time of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy.
As a result of this history, almost every family still has a small garden or a clod of earth. Even the smallest field is cultivated in this way. During the socialist era, which was also characterized by supply shortages, most families produced their own food in order to make ends meet. So it's no surprise for Attila Schatz, then, that Romania is a country of farmers.
When Romania entered the EU, we brought this wonderful legacy of, at that moment, almost 4 million small family farms, peasant farms, as we call them here in Romania. And we have a lot of farmland, which is in the hands of small farmers as private property, with an average acreage of around not even 2 hectares per farm. So very small, diverse family farms. Most farms engaged into polyculture, both raising animals and feed.
In Romania, there's still a widespread willingness among the population to cultivate their own piece of land. But here too, the small farm is dying out.
Still, Romania has several million small peasant family farms, but the situation is very drastic. More than 3 peasant farms disappear every hour in Romania.
But how did it come to this, I want to know?
When our regime changed in the 90s, in the 89-90, then a lot of the old communist oligarchs managed to fight their way up as new oligarchs. And the basis was land. And the basis was that they got really grabbing land, like just modifying titles, a lot of corruption, a lot of, wheeling and dealing with land. And later on, they started to sell those rights that they earned not in a legitimate way to other investment funds and companies and so on. And that's why we have the geography of land grabbing unfolding in Romania right now.
Studies show that the volume of land sales has increased sharply, especially since the financial crisis of 2008. Romania is cited as an extreme example where, according to some estimates, almost 40% of agricultural land is now owned by foreign investors. The situation in Bulgaria is said to be similar.
In Romania, major investors are trying to buy land on a large scale, mostly with legal means, but in some cases with illegal ones. Since 2011, for example, the Dutch Rabobank, which has 3 subsidiaries, including a €315 million investment fund called Rabo Farm, has acquired over 21,000 hectares of agricultural farmland throughout Romania. The bank has done business with convicted criminals and local politicians, according to the NGO Access to Land.
Attila Soch also confirms that in many cases, it takes the intervention of corrupt politicians to drive farmers from their land.
But of course, we know a lot of links of modern investors like Rabobank, like German investment funds. We know that they could never have made what they made without the tacit approval or even the support of politicians in Romania. And we know that every time a big investor comes to buy land or secure land for their agro-business, then they go to the mayor and to one politician from the parliament. So that we know the pattern of how they function, the chambers of commerces and so on.
At the Budapest Forum, a Central European conference dedicated to strengthening democracy, I meet Benjamin Novak. The American with Hungarian roots works in the Eastern European country as an investigative journalist for the New York Times. We meet here to talk more in detail about the land issue. What role do politics play when it comes to issues of agricultural land?
What our research found was we tried to tell the story of how this happened. My colleagues had been investigating this in other parts of Europe at the time, and unbeknownst to them, I had been working on this for about a year in Hungary.
But first, explains Novak, I have to understand the historical situation in the region in order to be able to classify the problem.
So there's a long and very tumultuous history to the story of land use in Central and Eastern Europe. As I'm sure many of the people who will be listening to this podcast are aware, the borders have often changed in this part of the world, and so have the type of political and economic regimes that presided over this vast territory. And to give you a very kind of sharp example of this, we see there's a very big difference between, for instance, the Soviet style of land use and what one might have seen under feudalism. And these changes happened oftentimes within the same century. So the ownership of land and who gets to use it, who gets to decide how it is used, has always been a very, very important part of the history of this region.
Today, Benjamin Novak is a political scientist who collaborated with a team of colleagues from across Europe on a fascinating New York Times dossier entitled Money Farmers. The authors wanted to know how state land was handled following the collapse of communism.
In Hungary's case, one of the things we saw, if we just go back to following the Second World War, was that you saw mass collectivization of land. So when Hungary's democratic transition came about, you had massive territories or vast areas of land that had been appropriated by the previous regime, essentially made into the state's property, and it was taken away from, in some case, smallholders or individuals who had vast agricultural land holdings, and something needed to be figured out.
Ever since 2010 and the re-election of Orban, the issue of land has taken on a paramount political significance. According to Novak, it became a tool for maintaining power.
The New York Times investigation revealed that hundreds of thousands of hectares of land in Hungary were given to loyal, influential stakeholders to support Orban's illiberal regime.
Oligarchs, but also family members of the Orban clique, were granted huge chunks of land, a modern form of feudalism, as the authors report.
In Fejér County, home to Hungary's populist Prime Minister Viktor Orban, an icon to Europe's far right, and a harsh critic of Brussels and European elites, Mr. Orban is happy to accept European Union money. The Times investigation found that he uses European subsidies as a patronage system that enriches his friends and family, protects his political interests, and punishes his rivals. Mr. Orban's government has auctioned off thousands of acres of state land to his family members and close associates, including one childhood friend who has become one of the richest men in the country, the Times investigation found. Those who control the land, in turn, qualify for millions in subsidies from the European Union.
It's an absolutely corrupt system, said József Angyán, who once served as Mr. Orban's Undersecretary for Rural Development.
And what happened in Hungary's case, as far as our study showed, was that right around the time Hungary joins the EU, you see just how powerful an interest it became for people or interest groups that were looking 10, 20, 30 years ahead. You start to see how access to EU subsidies for agriculture appear to have became a very serious driver for certain individuals or interests to obtain land. Once Hungary joined the EU, quite a lucrative agricultural subsidy program. So being able to hold the lease to state-owned lands for agriculture was something of a cash cow.
The New York Times found out that in 2011, Mr. Orban's new government began leasing out public land. At first, officials said that only local, small-scale farmers would be eligible for leases. But the plots ultimately went to politically connected individuals, who in some cases had been the sole bidders present at auctions. By 2015, hundreds of thousands of acres of public land were leased out, and much of it went to people close to Fidesz, according to records obtained from the government and Mr. Angyán.
Novak confirms this.
In Hungary's case, this was quite dubious after Hungary's ascension to the EU. But what happened after 2010 is Viktor Orban essentially privatized these lands. So lands that were previously available for lease through long-term state leases were suddenly sold off to a number of individuals close to the ruling party and the prime minister himself.
It's a form of modern feudalism, in which the remaining small farmers live in the shadow of large, politically powerful interests and are completely dependent on them. And the EU cap subsidies of the European Union also help to finance this.
According to a Times analysis of Hungarian payment data, in recent years, the largest private recipients of agricultural subsidies were companies controlled by Mr. Mészáros and Sándor Csányi, an influential Budapest-based businessman. Last year alone, companies controlled by the two men received a total of $28 million in subsidies. Mr. Mészáros' wealth is closely linked to the Prime Minister. He has built an empire by winning government contracts for projects largely funded by the European Union, and has recently bought up companies once owned by a business magnate who fell out of favor with Orban.
But just how did Benjamin Novak get such detailed data on land purchases?
After all, the land market in Hungary is completely lacking in transparency. Novak laughs when I ask him this. He just had journalist luck and found an insider, a source from the Orban regime who was willing to talk. His name is József Angyán. Having worked on the topic of sustainable agriculture for many years, the clever agricultural expert was well aware of the explosive social potential of the land issue.
And how could someone like that work for Orban?
Mr. Orban convinced him to join his government. And he promised him the moon and the stars. Come in, we're going to make this policy happen. Your policy is what the country needs. We're going to help out the small farmers. We're going to make sustainable agriculture, yada, yada, yada. And Mr. Angyán joined Mr. Orban's government. And Mr. Angyán quickly saw that, they're doing the exact opposite.
And what did Angyán do?
You saw agriculture becoming a pretty important aspect of a portfolio to several individuals close to the government, close to Mr. Orban and his family. And this is the kind of work that Mr. Angyán very diligently over several years wrote down and footnoted, citations, everything. It's what an investigative journalist would do, but at scale, and for a topic that is quite obscure for the average news consumer. And I think what he did in part there was to kind of leave a footprint of the legacy of this policy, so that maybe perhaps future generations, if they ever wanted to know what happened to the land in this country, they'd be able to see.
After the article was published, the Orban regime destroyed Anjan's career, while the money farmers became extremely rich thanks to the generous EU subsidies in the form of cap payments.
They're multi-millionaires and billionaires, like Andrej Babiš, for example, the former Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. Because also in the Czech Republic, state land was auctioned off on a large scale. The biggest profiteer was the owner of Agrofert, Babiš, the country's fifth richest man. Since May 2017, Agrofert has received more than 3.7 million euros per year in agricultural subsidies from the CAP, as studies by the Green Group in the European Parliament show. Agrofert is currently using the millions in subsidies to invest in fertilizer factories across Europe.
Although the billionaire Babiš and his agricultural company Agrofert benefited handsomely from EU agricultural cap subsidies, perhaps even more than anyone else in his country, this didn't stop him from railing against EU bureaucrats and whipping up anti-EU sentiment. In May, I happened to run into him during my investigative research at the right-wing populist conference, CPAC Hungary. Here you can hear him giving his speech. And you can also hear the Czech company owner Babiš stirring up anti-EU sentiment and opposing the ecological transformation, the Green Deal, despite the fact that he benefits greatly from the agricultural system.
The environmental governance social credit system, ESG, already aggressively pushed forward by progressive activists and fundamentalist politicians in Brussels, could soon be forced not only on companies, but on citizens as well. In a few years' time, we could be living in this Orwellian dystopia.
This right-wing populist agitation has already caught on with voters and is currently gaining momentum. In the most recent local elections in the autumn of 2024, Babiš's Arno party also won 10 out of the 13 districts. Benjamin Novak is not surprised. Since completing the New York Times research in Hungary, he has seen the shift that is underway in rural areas, and he sees how the political climate has changed for the people who still live there.
And the simple populist messages are catching on with people. The country, the people, and the land have been changed by land grabbing, he summarizes.
Another interesting aspect of our research that we found was, oftentimes the privatization of agricultural land came at the expense of local communities. So to give you an example, you may have a rural community, a small village or township where maybe there's several hundred people, where agriculture is the kind of lifeblood and has been for many, many decades, even before the Soviet times, has been the lifeblood for many of the people there. And when a large corporation comes in and acquires all of the land, especially with today's technology, using machines, using very advanced agricultural farming technologies to work the land, all of a sudden the people who actually live there don't really have any economic opportunities to keep their families afloat. And in the case of Hungary, what was quite striking was that in contrast to other countries that were analyzed in Western Europe, where governments seemed to put an emphasis on maintaining a lifeline for local farming communities through farming cooperatives, for instance, Hungary had a very different approach. They wanted to essentially centralize everything under these large corporations that were somehow dialed into the government and make them beholden to them. Such policies essentially economically disenfranchise small farmers. It puts them at the whims of larger corporations.
Thanks so much for joining us on this second episode of the Böll Europe podcast. And a huge thank you to all of our guests. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, and you can always leave us a review or your comments. You should also check out the web dossier of the Soil Atlas on our website. Just go to eu.böll.org/en/Soil Atlas. You can find the link and lots more information in the show notes. We hope you join us again for our next episode. Our author is Peter Kreisler. Production was done by Monobeat. Our editor was Lena Luig. Narration by Mariana Evenstein and Warner Poland. All the translations were done by Peter Rigney, and our music is by Zoe Keating.